Good evening, and welcome to DEAR. My name's Lynn Cook. I'm the curator at DEAR and organizer of this program with assistance from Kristen Poor and Patrick Heilman. It's a pleasure to introduce Vera Lutter tonight as our speaker on the work of Gerhard Richter. Vera was trained in Munich as a sculptor, but came to the US in 1993 and took an MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York, at which time she took up the practice of photography. Formerly, she'd been working mostly in ceramics, I believe. In 1995, she had her first exhibition here in the city. In 1999, in this very space, there was a two-part show with work of Rodney Graham based around the idea of the camera obscura. Around that time, she also took some photographs in DEAR Beacon before the building was renovated, and in 2005, we showed those works and others in Beacon. During this period, from 1995 onwards, Vera is shown very widely, both in this country and abroad, and most recently, it finished 2 weeks ago, I think, at the Gagosian Gallery on West 24th Street. It gives me great pleasure to have Vera here as a speaker. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you all for coming with this wonderful weather. I appreciate it. I would like to thank Lynn Cook for the invitation to speak in this lecture series. Kristen Poor and Brigitte Kovac and Patrick Heilman, all of DEAR Chelsea, were very helpful during the preparation for this talk. Thank you. Stephen Evans of DEAR Beacon was, as always, helpful and great to work with. I want to thank my assistant, Naomi Miller, who is responsible for the visual material in my lecture. She also helped me editing my writing. And I would like to thank the artist David Reed for being very generous with his time and his valuable insights. 6 Grey Mirrors, 2003. When invited to give a lecture in this series, I chose to speak about Gerhard Richter's Room in DEAR Beacon. Richter is known to be an artist with a very wide oeuvre. It includes painting, photography, sculpture, and installation works. The opening of DEAR Beacon was the first occasion for me to see an installation of Richter's Grey Mirrors, and I found them to be very impressive. For those of you that have not been to DEAR Beacon or that do not recall the installation in detail, I want to give a brief description. The Richter room contains 6 large grey mirrors. The dimension of each mirror are 13 feet and 1.5 inches by 13 feet and 1.5 inches, and there are 19 inches and 11/16 deep. As you can see in the technical drawing, the room has a rectangular footprint. It can be entered or exited in the center of each of the 2 long walls. The dimensions of the room are 33 feet and 8 inches by 78 feet. Richter chose this room and altered it by masking the original industrial structure, neutralizing it into a more conventional white cube. The room is illuminated by natural light only. A row of windows is set on all 4 sides right below the ceiling, but above the mirrors. No mirror hangs opposite an entryway. Therefore, when walking through the museum, nobody ever walks straight into a mirror. It is worth noticing that the Beacon room is a mirror in itself. If one were to divide it in length, width, or on the diagonal, a symmetrical half would remain that could be understood as a reflection of the whole. The mirrors are made from glass, and for technical reasons, each mirror consists of 2 panes that are hung next to one another. A gray pigment is either enameled or sprayed to the back of the glass. I never really understood which of the 2 or both were the application techniques involved. They're installed diametrically opposite to one another, each one facing the other. A wall-mounted fixture holds every mirror in place, but also permits each unit to be tilted. The tilt directs the reflected light on the piece. Each mirror is cantilevered differently, therefore each piece describes a different cycle from light to dark on its surface. Synchronized with the incoming daylight, a rotating spectrum of gray tones evolves on each mirror over the duration of a day. I will give you a brief history of works that have led up to this installation. Drawings for related works start as early as 1965. Four Panes of Glass remains the only piece of this series that was executed at the time. But at the same time, the late 60s and early 70s, Richter also starts to make sketches in which he constructs rooms around photographs and canvases. Robert Storr points out in his essay in the MoMA catalog that around 1964, Richter paints the image of a dead person behind glass. I never was able to identify this image, but we understand that Richter is already exploring the idea of seeing through glass, questioning what a clear layer of glass will do to the painter's way of seeing his subject. He even pushes the investigation one step further. After painting the piece, he frames it behind glass, doubling yet splitting the perspective experience for the viewer. The painter's painted vision of the same fact, an illusion for us now, gets overlaid with the reality of that vision, a sheet of glass. The viewer consequently is left with a third form. He or she is seeing a painting behind glass that the painter saw behind glass when he painted it. The artist sets the two sides off, infusing an element of minimal interference, the diffraction of a sheet of glass. The evidence of this piece makes us understand that Richter's interrogation of the relationship between painter and viewer, the interrogation of perception, is well underway. Equally interesting and related is Richter's exploration dedicated solely to methods of painting. In his window and shadow paintings, he examines placement and visual understanding with those most simple of all means, oil paint graded in color from white to dark. In window, he has made the painting the window, and the shadow the illusion of the shadow of the painting, which is the window. We are intrigued with the illusion of dimensionality, which suggests the objectness. As early as 1967, Richter was examining the problems of the location between viewer and artwork. He does so both sculpturally, or if you wish, architecturally, and in the tradition of painting. In 5 Doors 2, 1967, he not only explores cantilevering surfaces, meaning issues of light and shadow, but also he proposes to the mind the illusion of walking in and out of doors, entering both spaces, the one in front of the door and the one behind. In 1966, Richter starts to paint monochrome gray oil paintings. He will continue to do so every year through 1976. Richter said in a letter to Eddie Wilde on February 23, 1975, "Gray, it really has no message. It doesn't simulate feelings or occasions, and is actually neither visible nor invisible. Being so inconspicuous makes it suitable for transmitting, for illustrating, and in an almost illusionist way, similar to that of a photograph. And more than any other color, it is perfect for illustrating nothing." In 1981, Richter makes the very first clear mirror. He made these two plain mirrors. This is a studio view. For a show Georg Baselitz and Gerhard Richter had at the Kunsthalle Düsseldorf, curated by the director Jürgen Harten. Far-reaching rumors interpret why Richter first introduces an installation of mirrors at this occasion. He continues to make clear mirrors through 1986, and in 1991 the first gray mirrors appear. In 2002, Richter for the first time presents a full room of gray mirrors at the Deutsche Guggenheim Berlin in an exhibition titled 8 Grau, 8 Gray, where you see an installation shot here. My choice to speak about the work of Gerhard Richter at first intimidated me, but I was simply compelled by Richter's room in Beacon that in my understanding examines quintessential problems of art and art making. When I mentioned my topic to friends and colleagues, I received responses that surprised me. They spanned from, "I never liked this piece," "I could never see anything in this," "I'm really sorry for you who asked you to do this," "This is very brave of you and I don't envy you." So I'm not saying this to be comical and certainly not to imply criticism of the work. I'm trying to stress how stern, serious, and unapproachable the 6 gray mirrors at DIA appear to many people, artists included. In the course of preparing this talk, I've been to DIA Beacon many times, sometimes staring straight to the 6 gray mirrors, sometimes avoiding them, saving them for last, and visiting the installation only after I had seen many other things. I always stopped for a long time in the Richter room, walked around, sat on a bench, and hoped for other people to show up and for the opportunity to observe them. Strangely, the visitors often reminded me of the comments I had received from my friends. Many walked in, slowed down, hesitated, walked out. Some looked for the information sheet, read it, and left. Often they did not engage. They also did not seem to take notice of me in the room, observing them and the art. I think that this installation exists so strongly and exclusively in a perceptive way that it is hard for many visitors to engage with it at all. It is minimal and stripped of all seductiveness. It appears to be very little at first glance. In 1963, Joseph Beuys brought George Makunias, the New York-based founder of Fluxus, to the Düsseldorf Academy. There, Makunias developed a statement for the artist's new role within society. The artist must demonstrate his own dispensability. He must demonstrate the self-sufficiency of the audience. He must demonstrate that anything can substitute for art and anyone can do it. These demands resonated loudly in Düsseldorf when Richter arrived in 1961. I can see how this understanding of artist and audience resonates within the installation of 6 gray mirrors. In the process of familiarizing myself with 6 gray mirrors, I attempted to deconstruct them, to first find out what they are not, before I tried to understand what they are. I will show you rather light-hearted and playful illustrations of what I found them to be not. And then I will try to understand what they are. This is actually beautiful. I read somewhere somebody said this painting looks like a landing strip for shadows. I forget who said that, but I thought that was great. They are gray. Gray appears as though the defeat of color without denying color. Gray is a form of misery. It is boredom and can be depression. I always thought that gray was the painter's choice when he wanted to examine the total of all colors. However, this is not correct. When mixing all colors of the palette, one receives brown. But brown is organic, it is earthy, and may imply landscape. Painting gray can be a reflection of the self, of a mood the artist brings into his studio, a mood he brings to his work. It can be a gray day. It is also color without drama and without a mood, if not a gray mood. So here I'm stretching it, but I've always remembered this painting as a gray painting. And I think that the gray background sets up the monumentality with which this Venetian gentleman is portrayed. And I also thought it would lend itself beautifully to this lecture, as in this Renaissance painting, the window is displayed as always in Renaissance painting, the window being the vision, the illusion, the image. And I'm obviously thinking that Richter plays on that with his glass panes. This dates back to 2002, where my friend Dan Walsh, the artist, had an exhibition at the Paula Cooper Gallery where he, in a very inventive and also not only serious way, explored various different optical phenomena with which he produced the color gray. I know Dan is here tonight and he can probably explain what he did much better, but some of you may have seen the show. And the interesting thing is the title for his show was Seven Grays, and it just predates by a few months, I think, the introduction of the 8 grays that Richter showed at the Deutsche Guggenheim also in 2002. I think they overlapped without knowing of one another, and it's just another confirmation for me how much many artists, mainly painters, are engaged with the exploration of color gray. There's a saying on the sea that whatever stands still will be painted gray. I suppose that is to blend with the sea and to make it invisible. I'm now reading you from my notes on the 6 gray mirrors. This is a quote by the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa from his book of Disquiet. The only attitude worthy of a superior man is to persist in an activity he recognizes useless, to observe a discipline he knows is sterile, and to apply certain norms of philosophical and metaphysical thought that he considers utterly inconsequential. And here's a quote from Gerhard Richter from the daily practice of painting. One has to believe in what one is doing. One has to commit oneself inwardly in order to do painting. Once obsessed, one ultimately carries it to the point of believing that one might change human beings through painting. But if one lacks this passionate commitment, there's nothing left to do. Then it is best to leave it all alone, for basically, painting is pure idiocy. Increasing the light decreases the action. When the quantity of light increases in the room, the reflective quality of the mirrors becomes less visible. What is usually known to assist visual comprehension, light, causes in this case blindness. This relationship between light and object reminds me of photography and the way the lens interacts with direct versus reflected light. On the mirrors, direct light does not cause a sharp reflection. Instead, they adopt a soft, nearly powdery appearance, similar to sandblasted metal. From any point within the room, the viewer can always see at least one, if not 2 mirrors reflected in a mirror. The tilt initiates this relationship of the glass panes to one another. The tilt is not dominant in an architectural way. Instead, it articulates the reflective dialogue of the mirrors. The mirrors are mostly conceived as an image by means of their reflective action. Their architectural presence is minimal, but by means of the various angles by which each mirror confronts the room, it also shares the characteristics of an object. The reflective element takes command over the objectness. The presence of the gray mirrors does not impose on the viewer. A subtle dissonant quality is inherent in the installation. The glass panes suggest an imposing square, as though they were a canvas or an image, but they are not image. Each one of the gray mirrors is tilted differently, and none is installed on a parallel axis to the wall. However, they are installed on the horizontal level line, meaning they run parallel to the floor. While this is true for each one of the pieces, the tilts create a different relationship to the wall and to the space in which the viewer conceives of the installation. The conventional relationship of viewer to museum wall is irritated. In 6 Gray Mirrors, Richter solves the problems he had addressed in earlier works: the architectural problem of 4 panes of glass and the illusional problem of the painted doors too. He solves it by using a singular layer of reflection. The viewer looks into the piece, while by means of reflection looks out of the piece and visually establishes his architectural background. The combined properties of each mirror, the angle of inclination towards the room, and the reflective surface support the evidence of the illusion of space in the reflected image. This sets in motion a tender imbalance. It is an imbalance light enough to go unnoticed when not thoughtfully engaging with the piece. There is no imperative reason for the viewer to stop. However, if one engages with the piece, a subtle dialogue starts. Richter made the sketches for this fictional seascape in 1969. These are visuals from his atlas, from his collection of materials that he did throughout his artist life, and still does. In 1970, he followed with this painting. The disorienting quality of this painting is both subtle and obvious. Richter replaced the sky with another sea view, an action subtle enough that one wonders if sky could indeed look like that before realizing it could not. He betrays our sense of gravity and irritates our desire to physically relate ourselves to the space the painting offers. Armin Zweite said about Richter's paintings made from photographs, "The optical outcome suggests a reality that is blurred and hence intangible, that seems both semi-transparent and opaque." While studying Six Gray Mirrors and its relationship to the space it is in, I start to engage with the depth of the piece, meaning its dialogue of opacity versus translucency and its reflection. The soft gray tone allows for only one layer of reflection, meaning the mirrors don't allow for an endless replica of reflected images. I'm reading from a dictionary about diffraction. When light strikes an opaque body, a shadow forms on the side of the body that is shielded from the light source. Ordinarily, light travels in straight lines through a uniform, transparent medium, but those light waves that just pass the edge of the opaque body are bent or deflected. This diffraction produces a fuzzy border region between the shadow area and the light area. Upon close examination, it can be seen that this border region is actually a series of alternate dark and light lines extending both slightly into the shadow area and slightly into the lighted area. For photographers, this is all very interesting. This is a scientific explanation for gray. Were these pieces conventional mirrors, they would reflect one another endlessly and create a tunnel vision. Potentially, this could set off a sensation of vertigo in the viewer. Such a piece would be confrontational and entirely different from what it is now. One can see oneself reflected in the gray mirror, and one can see in the reflection the gallery space and the piece opposite the piece one is looking into. The viewer finds himself interposed in a perceptive multitude of layers. Inside the Richter room, the viewer at all times stands between two gray mirrors, a real interposition. But the viewer also stands in something like a hybrid interposition. He or she stands in front of the piece she is looking into, seeing her own reflection in the piece, while behind her reflected self is the reflection of the piece opposite the one she is standing in front of, the piece installed behind her real back. It is important to remember that this is all still happening on the same singular surface plane. With the installation of 6 gray mirrors, Richter is continuously interrogating the two entities of an immediate experience. He folds into one the fact of being inside the space and the perception of it. What we perceive starts to intrude on the notion of what is really around us. It wants to betray our understanding of our physical surroundings in favor of an illusional image. When we doubt what we are seeing or interrupt the dialogue with the piece, the image disappears. We are left in suspense. Another quote from Gerhard Richter: "I don't distrust reality of which I know next to nothing. I mistrust the picture of reality conveyed to us by our senses, which is imperfect and circumscribed." More immediate and less complex, of course, is the thought of a self-portrait. This is Richter in his studio, reflecting himself in one of the gray mirrors. The condition of the mirror seems to be the ground of all identity and difference at once. When the artist Gerhard Richter is looking into the mirror, the anonymous viewer is looking back. This encounter collapses the role of the artist and the role of the viewer. I see myself outside myself as if someone else, says Narcissus. Again, I'm quoting Richter. Seeing is the decisive act, and ultimately it places the maker and the viewer on the same level. I think that the highly cerebral form Richter found for 6 gray mirrors is an attempt to objectify the process of encounter between viewer and artwork on one hand, and between artist as viewer on the other. The presentation does not make room for drama of any sort. It is silent and an intellectual dialogue, and it dismisses the idea of a dramatized self. In interviews and writings, Richter has many times emphasized his abiding distrust against overly introspective painting and self-dramatizing forms. Another beautiful piece in which Richter explores many things but duality, dialogue, reflection is, can we see it, Naomi? Another beautiful piece which shows us how deeply Richter preoccupied himself throughout his career with the question of dialogue versus solitary artist self is 2 sculptures for a room by Palermo, 1971, a collaboration between Palermo and Richter. It is altogether a surprising piece. The walls of the room are painted in an ochre color, framed with a white band around the edges, and 2 sculptures are set up facing each other. They are the casts of both Richter and Palermo. The wall drawings first appeared in a show Blinky Palermo had at the Gallery Heiner Friedrich in Munich in 1971. A few months later, he repeated the same installation at Heiner Friedrich's gallery in Cologne, and it was here that Richter added the 2 casts. This is Palermo, and this is Richter. Finding the heads of 2 artists that were close friends in the same room makes us assume they are in conversation. The heads sit on pedestals and are installed looking face to face, not only at one another, but also at the viewer. But their lips are closed, and so are their eyes. To assume that this is simply due to the fact that it's better to keep your mouth and eyes shut when a cast is taken seems a bit too simple. But up to this point, while silently awaiting those to come. But the silence between the artists also leaves the platform of sound to the viewers, or if you wish, the visitors of the room. The active dialogue is theirs, while the artists not only observe each other and the wall drawings, but also the viewers in the room. Richter oversaw the reinstallation of this piece in the Lenbach House in Munich in 1984, 7 years after Palermo's death. It is there on permanent view. I'm returning to the 6 gray mirrors in Beacon. The installation appears to me a questioning of all those issues that the artist, any artist, is at all times confronted with. The piece questions the role of the image, the artifact, and that it is not an object that one looks at, but it is surface one looks into. It is glass. It questions the role of the artist in that it makes the self look straight back at itself as the viewer and the subject. It questions the relationship of the artist with the artwork by means of the earlier described interposition of artist and artwork. The artist seeing herself, at once reflected in the piece, in front of herself, and before the piece reflected. It questions the relationship of the artwork with the space it is installed in. It questions the relationship of one art object with the other, as one element of the installation reflects itself within the multitude of the others. The piece enters into a silent monologue. It gives evidence to the choreography of viewer moving through the exhibition space, interacting with the artwork and the space. The fact that there is no image without the viewer present in the space brings on the fundamental issue of perception, the subject seeing, a point that Duchamp already explored much earlier and pushed to a more extreme statement when he claimed that artwork does not even exist unless it's seen. Six Grey Mirrors is a physical embodiment of that point. It gives evidence to the everlasting question within art making and art critique: who sees what, where and when, and where does the image happen? Not painting. The installation of Six Grey Mirrors references painting by supporting the conventional properties of painting. The mirrors are pigmented rectangular structures mounted to the wall, but they're not painting, not least because there is no tangible image. They are stripped of the conventional material connotations of painting. There is no evidence of paint or brushstroke. Not mirror. Even though the grey mirrors are reflective glass panes, they do not qualify as mirrors, in the sense that they don't engage the viewer in a self-conscious way. The grey enameled glass betrays the simple idea of reflection with its consideration of painting. Not photography. The grey mirror's affinity to photography is obvious. We know of the physical relationship between signifier and index in the photographic image, the phenomenon that by means of reflected light rays, an image is rendered. It is exactly that essential relationship that gives evidence to the image we see in the grey mirrors. But again, as soon as we feel a relation can be established, it breaks away again. In photography, the chemical process inside the camera sets the groundwork for a tangible image. The grey mirrors have no tangible image. Instead, all images evanesce the moment we see them. Richter says of himself, "I have no program, no style, no direction. I stay clear of definitions. I don't know what I want. I'm inconsistent, non-committal, passive." I've come to understand Six Grey Mirrors as a monster. The tangential relationship the installation has with painting, photography, sculpture, and architecture suggests it were existing within the realm of these domains, but it does not. The Six Grey Mirrors are at best described as everything they are not. For me, they are the genius amalgam, an all-inclusive conclusion of this complex and multifaceted artist's work. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah. If anyone has questions,
I should probably just say that in preparation for this talk, I read texts by Lynn Cook, Robert Storr, and Armin Zweite. I read Richter's notes, writings, and interviews ever since they were published in 1993. What I did not read is Benjamin Buchlow's text of the installation of 8 Grey. There's a beautiful publication that documents the piece that Richter first introduced at the Guggenheim in Berlin. And I think it's genius, but that's exactly why I didn't read it. I read it tomorrow. So if anyone has questions, I'm happy to take them. No, I've always looked at it. And I've always, I don't really know why, because, I mean, I was so early in my career or artistic development, but that installation of the two sculptures for a room by Palermo has just always moved me so much. And it was installed at the Lindbach House in 1984, and that's exactly when I moved to Munich to study there. And I've been asking myself since, I've been talking to David Reed about that, either there was a room prior to this installation, or in the same room, Richter also at some point showed 6 gray paintings. So that was always just an installation that was very present to me. And he was just always also known to be a very appreciated teacher and a very respected figure. So he was on my mind in that way. Yes?
What about his other work? It seems like just a narrow focus to just talk about mirrors and gray. He did like so much other kinds of paintings, right?
Yeah, that's true, but I felt that I had to. I'm not really competent enough to talk about Richter's paintings, and I chose this specific installation also because it's part of the Dia collection. And I feel, as I said, as I tried to work out in the text that I read, that it really, everything that Richter does works towards the same means, and I feel like he brings it together in such a genius way in this installation. Incredibly great capacities have written about Richter's painting. It just doesn't seem to be appropriate for me to try to include all of that in one evening. Pamela?
Yeah, I really like the focus of it. And I must say, I was surprised because when I knew you were going to do this, I thought, oh, well, she'll talk about Richter's photographs. You know, because she's a photographer. And when you got to this, well, you're working with the camera, obscura. So when you got to that one point where you said, oh, a photograph, it's obvious. Could you say maybe a few more words about maybe the relationship of, was it not the photographic basics at all of Richter's work that interested you, or was there an aspect of it, or is that aspect of it already in the installation that you discussed that I just don't know it, because I never understood those words either.
I mean, I've never dreamt of giving a lecture on Gerhard Richter until Lynn invited me to do something in this series, and it's really due to the 6 gray mirrors in Dia Beacon that when I first saw them, they just compelled me and struck me as so remarkable, and. Yeah, it's so hard to say what they are. That's what I've been talking about, everything that they are not. But the reflected image and the dialogue with the room, the dialogue with one another, yet not producing an image while constantly working with reflected light. And the viewer's presence that could be, you know, in the photographic medium, you would have the photographer and the camera and the reflected light and the image. He just sets up this dialogue that is so independent of any medium, but also only occurs when somebody's present in the room. It's so ephemeral, really. And
Is that like your work? That moment?
is that like my work? I don't know. I don't know. I certainly, and these images have been shown at Dia Beacon, but otherwise, I think we're only exhibited abroad in Brazil at the Biennale or in Graz at the museum show that I had there. But I have explored making images by means of mirrors. So that kind of dialogue of the space and the fictional space and the reflected image versus the real image and the relationship to the viewer, that was very much on my mind for a long time, and I guess that's part of the reason why I so strongly responded to the Richter room. Yes.
When you're talking about the paradox of what they are and what they are not, when you're talking about Richter's practice with painting and sculpture and photography, would you also add mirror to that list of what they both are and are not?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, because I mean, the mirror, since there is no camera, the mirror is the medium that reflects the image. But then he so geniusly paints it, he back paints it gray, or however that gray stuff got on the back, it doesn't really matter, but they're back enameled gray, with which he cuts off the conventional quality of a mirror that would give us a tunnel vision, and then it would all be about being in a mirror cabinet and the sort of more sensational quality of that experience. And so without their reflective purposes, which is a characteristic of a mirror, the whole dialogue in the room wouldn't start. Then they aren't, because I feel like they're so subdued. They're so, when you think they're a mirror, you immediately see a gray canvas, especially when you know his body of work. No more questions?